Academica Media. From Academica Media Studios in Miami, Florida, it's Big Ideas in Education, a weekly recap of inspiration and innovation in your schools.
Hello, education lovers. Welcome to the program. Ryan Kairalla here from Academica Media, welcoming you to this week's installment of Big Ideas in Education. Joining us on the program this week for an interview is Sheryl Cababa. She is the Chief Design Officer of the Insights Design and Development Studio Substantial. Recently, our guest teamed up with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to provide equity-centered technical assistance for the foundation's grantees and in incorporating design research into its programming. She is an advocate for the importance of systems thinking in education. You can find out more about her work by visiting substantial.com/edtech. Sheryl, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excited to have you here. For the uninitiated, which would probably include the person interviewing you, can you give us a little bit of background on what systems thinking and design thinking is?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll start out with design thinking because my background is as a product designer as well as a design researcher. And so design thinking is really an iterative process that you can use to problem solve and is focused on the people for whom you're designing. So some good examples of that are, if you think about any sort of digital product and how as they're designing digital product, they're constantly doing testing with folks who are going to be the end users of those products. And I'm sure anyone who's interacted with any digital products knows that there are good ones and there are bad ones. And the idea is that you are truly centering their experience, you're learning from them and their context before you even set out on designing for them. And then as you're designing, you kind of like involve them during the process so that the folks who are going to be using your products are testing it along the way. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to make changes as you're going through the design process, primarily to save money in the process to make sure you're not designing the wrong thing. And then as you're testing, before you build anything out, particularly with digital products, you're not wasting time and energy actually building a thing that will be difficult to use or won't be used at the end of the day. So you're doing a lot of this work up front and iteratively in order to be able to facilitate that process and to design best for those who will be using products at the end of the day.
I can see how those kind of activities would benefit a wide range of industries. And indeed, in your career, you've served a wide range of industries in consultations, involving systems thinking and design thinking. And I would imagine the education industry in particular is one that would benefit from enhanced systems thinking, design thinking. What got you interested in providing this sort of work in this field?
Yeah, I think education is a really super interesting space. My sort of initial background in design was in consumer products. So I worked for Microsoft, I worked for Philips, and you're basically kind of just like designing things that the buyer and the consumer are the same people. If you're going to be but I worked on software products for Microsoft, and essentially the same person who might be buying them is the same person who might be using them. I worked on like personal financial software, and same with Philips. If you're buying appliances or something, I worked on an early version of a competitor to the Fitbit for Philips, and that's something that you consider when you're designing consumer products. In education, the buyers and the users are very different people. You have students and teachers in the classroom oftentimes using the products that somebody else is buying. And so the motivations, the incentives, and what have you are quite different. And that's where systems thinking comes in. So systems thinking acknowledges that there's different stakeholders in the system and that they all have different types of motivations as well as incentives. And so acknowledging that and making sure that all those all of those different stakeholders are involved in the design process, as let's say you're designing ed tech, is really important in order to ensure that the creation and the use of a product is going to be successful and that you actually have good outcomes. And so that is kind of like where those things intersect, and why I think design plus systems thinking is actually really great in the education space, because you can have sort of that innovative angle, that very user-focused angle of design thinking, but then you have to also take that systems lens of understanding there are all these other different stakeholders within the system that you need to acknowledge in order to facilitate the use of, you know, products that you might be designing.
As an industry, how are we doing with respect to systems thinking and design thinking in education? Is there a particular area where you think we need to improve?
Yeah, it's really super interesting. I mean, I work quite often with product development teams, and I'm always really surprised at how infrequently the people who are designing and developing products for education actually directly talk to students and teachers.
Yeah.
And I think there are some reasons for that. Like, product development cycles are really fast. Oftentimes you're focused on just like making a thing work. And it sometimes leaves very little room to actually check in with who your end users are going to be. There's also just lots of secondary research, you know, just like literature in education that drives, you know, decisions about what is effective in teaching, etc. And then, so at the end of the day, I feel like oftentimes people don't feel necessarily like a drive or a need to interact directly with who their end users might be. But it's so valuable, because then you kind of get to those qualitative insights of just like the things that really frustrate them in their context, especially if you do what we call contextual inquiry and you're in classrooms, you're kind of, you know, understanding the direct experiences of students and teachers. You can kind of see what their barriers might be. What are the sort of environmental things you need to take into consideration? What other kinds of software are they using? And it provides so much value, but it does take time and energy. And I think that's a reason that oftentimes you see the end users less involved in the process than I feel that they should be. So I think there's definitely room for improvement there. And I'm not just calling out the education domain. I think this happens everywhere. It happens in healthcare. It happens in government.
Oh,
and
but
so, yeah.
I would say that I do think it's a particularly pronounced problem in education, specifically ed tech. I don't think I've ever come across an industry that has more product market fit problems than education technology. You have a lot of entrepreneurs who are very skilled at what they do, obviously, who are creating these really impressive pieces of ed tech that have great technology behind them and are certainly well-intentioned, but often stay on the shelves when they find their way into schools, because there wasn't a lot of discussion with the end users, with the actual schools, to make sure that this great piece of technology would actually have practical uses in the classroom. And so, yeah, that conversation that you're talking about, where these ed tech folks are engaging these education stakeholders to make sure that the products have practical use, I don't think that's happening enough.
Yeah. And I totally agree with you on that. I think one book that I recommend quite often to those who are designing ed tech products is Failure to Disrupt by Justin Reich. And he, you know, it's basically an articulation of, I think there's a lot of technology people who see education as a space that's ripe for disruption. They're like, everything is happening wrong in that space. And so I can come in there with this like product with this AI tutor, or I can come into this space with like a video based platform, and I can totally disrupt the way education is happening. And come to find like that does not happen in a space like education, where there's all of these other things that your product is going to intersect with. There's all of these different stakeholders. There's learning management systems. There's funding, you know, there's the way assessments happen. There's the regulatory environment. And I think like the way that technologists approach disruption in the consumer space in tech just doesn't work in a space like education because of all of those sort of systems oriented kind of intersections that oftentimes they don't acknowledge. You can't just like drop something into the education space and be like, this is going to be a silver bullet, it's going to change everything. And in that book, he points to things like massive online courses and how even like 10 years ago, people were like, this is going to change the future of education. And like, do you hear anything about that now? It's just, it's actually wild. That happens so often in this space that I think, yeah, the key to that is to understand, like, in education, change is incremental and it involves a lot of people. It involves a lot of decision makers. And once you kind of understand that, you can kind of take an approach to disrupting whatever is going wrong with education, but in that sort of like incremental and systematic approach.
Do you have any success stories that you could share with us, either in your own experience or someone that you know or work with that was able to thread that needle, that was able to create some really great ed tech innovations because they did the work of interacting with the stakeholder communities in education?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, like, change is totally incremental. So I don't think I can be like, oh, here's a silver bullet that's like a success story. But one thing that my team and I worked on a few years ago was that the Gates Foundation sort of put out this grand challenge, which is sort of a challenge for the field to come up with solutions for a certain space. And it was oriented around the idea of Algebra 1 and how there is sort of disparities between students within different demographics in terms of like how successful they are in taking Algebra 1 and that setting them up for, you know, their educational career in the future, because Algebra 1 is basically it's kind of a gateway course for students, and it can either set you up to be like prepared for college, or if you are kind of routed in a way that prevents you essentially from taking it in middle school, that can really disrupt your ability to be able to apply to college, to be able to study STEM in college, etc. And so the Gates Foundation was really like looking at this as a problem space where maybe some of this incremental change could happen. And one of the things that we found as we were kind of working on this project and we were talking with teachers and students is that there isn't like one thing that you could fund in this space that would get you there. So like, it wasn't just like a grand challenge around, okay, let's say virtual tutoring is like what we're going to focus on, and we want technology platforms to do that. What we found is like that maybe is one kind of solution, but there's also the idea of students need better support systems. There's the issue of, you know, kind of like where pedagogy can be strengthened and what that means for teacher practice. Like teacher professional development is a piece that could be funded better. Feedback mechanisms, like the way assessments work, could be funded better. And what ended up happening is they, instead of like funding in like one direct category, they funded different sort of ideas that were oriented around these kind of like different potential points of intervention, which is kind of a systems thinking thing, is like there are different points of intervention that can lead to better outcomes. And so they funded kind of different organizations that were focused on, you know, for example, teacher professional development, whereas other organizations were focused on things like virtual tutoring. And taking that sort of different points of intervention approach just helps create more of like a holistic view of like, how do you get to better outcomes? And so I know it sounds kind of like a boring story compared to like a TED Talk that is like, there's this one, there's this one idea that was super successful, but the fact that they can spread their funding around in that way, I think kind of just chips away at the problem in a way that acknowledges that there are systemic barriers that you need to kind of overcome in order to make a difference.
I mean, you might not think that's a great example of a success story, but I do, because what it represents to me is a shift in mindset that we all need to have in education that was brought about by systems thinking, which is oftentimes the solution is not just a solution, it is solutions. It is doing a lot of things at perhaps a smaller scale rather than the one silver bullet that you noted at a big scale. It's attacking a problem at multiple points, not just in the classroom, but perhaps addressing sociological factors as well. And I guess that's how organizations like the Gates Foundation can approach this, right? Because they have the resources to, give a smaller amount of grant funding to multiple different pivot points that can help solve a problem through multiple fronts. Tell us a little bit more about your work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. That must be really, really enriching for you.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's great to work with an organization that has these kinds of resources that's interested in kind of making this kind of social impact. And part of our work with them is really emphasizing student voice throughout the processes that we're involved in. So a lot of the work that we do helps to inform their investment strategies. And this is a really interesting place when it comes to design, because it's not necessarily kind of designing end products like for people to use, as I was mentioning before. It is oriented around like, okay, where can we kind of direct interventions? Where can we direct funding so that we can make change? And our job is to ensure that students are involved in that process. So it's really empowering for students. And we work all the way from pre-K all the way up to post-secondary. And so, for example, when we're working with the Gates Foundation on post-secondary based projects, it's really super interesting for college students to be kind of involved and help us to kind of determine where, kind of the insights around their experiences that can then inform investment. So it's interesting because I think it's a little bit different than traditional forms of research, because we look at it as really participatory design, not just extracting people's kind of context and understanding where their frustrations are, but also involving them in kind of like, what do you think should be funded? Where do you think money should go to improve your experience? And it's really great because, the foundation is also really equity focused in terms of investing in improving outcomes for Black and Latino students in the American school system, for example. And so engaging those students in those demographics in this process can be a really great reciprocal experience for them. And that's primarily our focus, is really like thinking about like, how can students really be part of this process from beginning to end? And how can we use kind of design research in a way that emphasizes that and involves them within kind of not just the design of products and services at the end of the day, but the design of investment and resources and where those things go.
Well, if you're going to make stakeholder engagement one of the significant components of achieving great outcomes in education, you better make one of those stakeholder groups the students. So that makes perfect sense. And certainly students from under-resourced and underrepresented communities, giving them a particularly strong voice sounds like a recipe for success. Our guest has been Sheryl Cababa. She's the Chief Design Officer at Substantial. You can find out more about her work by visiting substantial.com/edtech. Sheryl, before we let you go, we got one last question for you. If with the snap of your fingers, you could make any change to the education system, what change would it be?
Okay, so being someone who's based in America, but I've lived in other countries, what I would do with the snap of my fingers is redistribute resources so that schools had the same resources across the board. I think there are so many issues in our current education system because there's so many schools that don't have the same richness of resources that other schools do. And that affects everything from student experience to performance to the way these environments are assessed to the kinds of teachers that teach in those environments and how much those teachers aren't valued. And so I think basically having a more equal distribution of resources would be what I would do. And again, systems thinking thing, I know it sounds like it's not a very sexy thing, but yeah, it would make a huge difference in my mind.
Sheryl, thank you so much for your insight this week. This has been a real treat. Please don't be a stranger. We'd love to have you on the show again real soon.
Thank you. This was a great conversation. Thanks so much.
And thank you all for checking out Big Ideas in Education. We'll see you next week.
The views expressed on the preceding program have been those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Academica, its clients, staff, affiliates, or advertisers.